everybody, I'm Pastor AJ Houseman, and welcome to 10-Foot Pole, a podcast dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Season 4, Episode 1. I am so excited. So we are embarking on our 5-week study of God-ordained violence and the book of Judges. So for those of you that are working with this, with your church groups, with your pub theologies, or just other groups of friends, there is a study guide that will come out each week with the episode that you can find on our website, 10footpolepodcast.com. So thanks everyone for joining us for this. Our guest for this very first episode, I couldn't resist. I absolutely could not resist. Our guest is Rabbi Evan Ravski, who is from the congregation Bethel.
Synagogue Emmanuel.
I was close. As soon as I said it, I knew I was wrong. Emmanuel. See, there you go. Look at me being a dumb Christian in the corner over here.
No.
And so I'm so excited, Rabbi, to have you here to bring in some expertise of some of these things.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be back.
I appreciate it. I also want to say, you make the best ice cream I've literally ever had in my life.
Thank you.
And I still keep thinking about when am I going to get more ice cream, which is so fantastic. I love that that's a special skill of yours. Rabbi made ice cream, so I joined Synagogue Emmanuel for Shavuot this past spring, and it was absolutely fantastic. He made ice cream, and I was like, wow, this is like the best ice cream literally that I've ever had. And so thank you for sharing those gifts and talents.
What's your favorite flavor?
From that evening?
No, just in general.
Oh man, I'm a really just like a generic person, like a good vanilla.
Okay.
So like the milk and honey was so good.
That was a good one.
That was really, really, really good. Big fan of that honey flavor in there.
Okay. Now I know. I can make it again.
Yeah. Oh, so good. So, Rabbi, thanks for coming and diving into this super fun topic, because this is just how I jam. They're like, oh, what can we do that's like the most uncomfortable thing? Violence. Yep, let's do it. Let's talk about it.
Especially divinely ordained violence.
Yes,
Like,
exactly.
We want God to be good, and then God goes and commands us to kill lots of people.
Yeah. And we're going to get into that. And I just, just some things for the audience to understand and also for you to understand. As we do follow, the Revised Common Lectionary, this doesn't come up. Judges is not in our lectionary at all. And so this can be, for a lot of Christians, somewhat unknown material. Yeah.
Right, so this, the portion that we're going to read today, or that we're going to focus on, right, Judges 4, we actually read this once a year. Whenever we get to the Song of the Sea, right? Whenever we're reading Exodus 13, 14, 15, we read this portion of Judges afterwards in parallel with it. Yeah.
Okay.
Just so we read it. It doesn't come up for you. For us, it comes up once a year, January-ish.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. February, around then.
Yeah, I mean, but do you guys like talk about it often, or you just like read through it and move on?
It depends on the scenario. It depends what the rabbi is preaching about that week. You have the option of talking about it, or you can focus on the Song of the Sea and Miriam and the women dancing with the timbrels. I like to compare it a lot because what we're looking at today, right? The text that's inspiring the conversation, Judges 4 with Judges 5, because it's the same story repeated twice, is actually one of the 5 songs that's in the Bible. And so there's only like 5 times where the word shirah in Hebrew is used, and this is one of them. So we do study it in conjunction with those 5 other songs.
Okay.
Song of the Sea being another one.
But not necessarily from the lens of like the
violence.
Yeah, the actions.
Well, I mean, you can't ignore it.
Yeah. Oh no, you cannot. You open the book of Judges, there is no ignoring.
You can't ignore it, but I think here it's more. It's going to be hard to explain this over a podcast without a visual, but the way that these are written in the Hebrew text, the Song of Deboarh and the Song of the Sea, it's written in a very interesting way where it looks almost like bricks. It's like a couple words, like a phrase, and then there's a big space in the Torah, and then there's another brick, and then below it, underneath those words, there's space, but underneath where there was space on the line above is a phrase. And so it looks like bricks basically stacked over each other in the text when it's written. And so we see a lot of parallels to it.
Oh.
Maybe with the study sheet, I should, find a picture for you.
Yeah.
And then people can see how we're talking about.
Exactly. And also, I can attach it for those that aren't using the study sheet too. I can still link it in the details. So yeah, for sure. That's a great idea. So before we read the text specifically, let's talk about just a little bit of background to the book of Judges. So it is part of the I always mess up that word.
Deuteronomic.
History. Thank you. There's a couple words I can't say. That's one of them. And I just Deuteronomic. Is that right?
Yeah, that was right.
Oh, sweet. Maybe I can do it if I try hard enough. It's part of that history. So kind of what happens is the very beginning is where Joshua dies. So we know the story of Joshua. Before that, they come into the promised land, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is, quote, the time, and you hear this phrase repeated multiple times, there was no king of Israel, right? That's the sort of the main theme, that there was no king. The people fall into their bad habits, worshiping others, doing the things they're not supposed to do, and God allows them to be conquered, tortured, punished, and then they cry out to God. And then God goes, okay, and sends a judge or some kind of savior hero to come in and save the people once more.
Yeah, it's the biblical cycle, right? It happens throughout the Torah. It happens throughout everything of exactly that, right? The people and God are getting along great. The people start, being people and messing up. They're transgressing. They're doing everything they're not supposed to do. God gets angry. God punishes them. They repent. They cry. Whatever. Eventually God, forgives them, depending on how. And so, so the judges are also prophets. Because they're bringing God's message to the people of, be better. I would say that all these people who are mentioned in Judges are also in some way prophets. They're the interim leader in that, sandwich generation between Moses, Joshua, and when we're going to get to Kings, right? We're going to start with Saul by the time we get to the end of this.
Yeah.
They're that sandwich generation of leaders.
Where things are just kind of in disarray. All the tribes are kind of doing their own thing, and everyone's not really... Because it starts off the beginning part, right? They're fighting outsiders, and then eventually by the time we get to end of Judges, it's sort of like a civil war. They're fighting each other.
Right. Well, it's the continuing story of a people trying to establish themselves in a land, right? The entire Torah, right? The 5 books of Moses is the people making their way to the land. Well, from the Exodus of Egypt in the book of Exodus through the end of Deuteronomy, it's the people getting to the promised land, getting to Israel. Joshua is about conquering the land. And then Judges is them figuring out, now what?
Yeah, now we're
right?
here.
Now we're here. We have to be self-autonomous. How do we do that?
But they're still living alongside others who also lived in that land.
There are some populations that are there. They are supposed to, when they're conquering the land, there's these 7 nations that God tells them that they have to wipe out completely. And so
some God-ordained violence there.
I was, debating whether to hold that one, till later or not. So there's those 7 nations that we're supposed to destroy completely, but there are still other people that are there that they are living, and a lot of the anxiety comes of assimilation and keeping those people away so that the Israelites don't fall back into idol worship or anything like that. So there is that tension going on in the land. But they don't yet have the temple in Jerusalem. They're not going to have that until Solomon comes around. Right. They don't have a structure of government yet. This is the early days of the 13 colonies, right? Before
they're all just tribes. They're doing their own thing.
They're all just tribes doing their own thing, and trying to figure it out. And so every so often you get, this judge or this prophet to come along and remind them that they're not 12 distinct tribes, but they're actually one people, and they better do right.
Yeah. So it's kind of arranged into 3 segments. So there's like an intro, and then we get into the stories of all the judges, and then there's like an epilogue. And the stories of the judges, so there's 12 judges. There's like 6 major judges, and then we consider 6 minor judges that have a few sentences about them, but we include them
books
in
that are like 4 chapters, 3
Yeah.
chapters, long. Yeah.
And then, so it's mostly like a collection of stories about these heroes that get raised up and save the Israelite people in battle. Battle against, quote, their enemies and like these other nations warring groups that are either oppressing them or trying to oppress them or take over their land.
Right. And certainly where the, like you said, where the difference here is, it's not when we get to the book of Samuel and Kings, you have prophets who go alongside the kings and serve for multiple generations, right, through multiple monarchies. The judges are episodes, right? It's not someone who is a judge, at least not that we hear about, for 60, 70 years. You get stories like Samson, which is a little bit out of his early life, but then this one episode about him and his hair and killing the Philistines, and then Samson disappears and we don't hear about him.
Yeah. Or like they have a job to do, they do it, and they're done.
And it's over. Right. And that's next story, next judge.
Next judge, exactly. So I think from my understanding is and the reason behind that is it's sort of like a compilation of stories, and that it started out like the original quote like book of saviors made up stories of Ehud. How do you say that?
Ehud.
See, I'm asking you. You're the professional. Yeah. Jael. Would you say Jael? The Song of Deboarh and parts of Gideon, and then it was in a large, and then kind of include more, and they called it the Wars of Yahweh, and then when it became sort of the Book of Judges as we know it is when it goes through its final Deuteronomistic revision. Was that?
Sure, yes, that was good.
That a lot of scholars either put it during the exilic period in like the 6th century BCE, though some say that like the first draft, so like the first kind of round of these stories being put together was in the 7th century BCE under King Josiah, which honestly makes sense to me. If you think about kind of the things that King Josiah was doing and sort of like, let's get these stories published so people understand why it's important for us to have a king, which also, comes to that period where they found Deuteronomy. Yeah, right.
In the temple floor.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, if they
found,
if when things are not looking good, you want a text to be there that reminds the people what happens if you don't have a king, right?
Exactly.
If there's rebellion, you want people to remember what it was like before. And it was good when it was good in Judges, and then it's not so great when it's not so great in Judges.
Another sort of, this kind of then like the final compilation in like the 6th century BC in the exilic period is sort of to understand the question that they're asking, why has God forsaken us? Right? And then the book of Judges is kind of seems to indicate that it's God has not forsaken us, but rather it's we have forsaken God.
Yeah.
Does that sound about right to you?
Sounds about right.
Okay. So that being said, all of these stories with these judges is very violent. There's no really other way to put it. It's very, very gruesome violence. And so let's just dive into it. We'll dive into our first story of some nice violence in this book, and then so
female-led violence. We should point
out
female-led
yeah,
violence.
Of course, it's always the women.
It's all the women. It's
which actually the way it's laid out is like an honor, right? Like, and Deborah says, to Barak, this is not going to be your glory. A woman gets this glory.
Yeah,
but that it's put in that tone, right?
He's the general. She's the one here who takes the lead, and makes it all happen. But then it's not even Deborah who ends up being the hero of the story. It's someone completely, sort of out of left field that just like shows up. Well, Sisera shows up at her tent.
Not even an Israelite.
Not even an Israelite. Right? Just
all right, well, spoiler alert. Jeez.
Spoiler.
Okay. So Rabbi is graciously agreed to read us our text today. Could you please tell us, just to say to what verses and stuff we're reading, and then what translation you're going to read?
Yeah, so we're in Judges chapter 4, verses 12 to 24, to the end of the chapter. I'm reading from the JPS version, the Jewish Publication Society version, which is, I think it was revised in just last year, I think, in 2023.
Oh, okay, cool.
But if not, it's a 1985 or so text translation, that is. So starting with verse 12. Sisera was informed that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. So Sisera ordered all his chariots, 900 iron chariots, and all the troops that he had to move from Haroset Goyim to Wadi Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Up! This is the day on which God will deliver Sisera into your hands. God is marching before you." Barak charged down Mount Tabor, followed by 10,000 men. And God threw Sisera and all his chariots and army into a panic before the onslaught of Barak. Sisera leaped from his chariot and fled on foot, as Barak pursued the chariots and the soldiers as far as Haroset Goyim. All of Sisera's soldiers fell by the sword. None was left. Not one was left. Sisera, meanwhile, had fled on foot to the tent of Jael, wife of Heber, the Kenite, for there was friendship between King Yavin of Chazor and the family of Heber the Kenite. Jael came out to greet Sisera and said to him, "Come in, my lord, come in here, do not be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. He said to her, "Please, let me have some water, I am thirsty." She opened a skin of milk and gave some to him to drink, and she covered him again. He said to her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent. If anybody comes and asks you if there is anybody here, say no." Then Jael, wife of Heber, took a tent pin and grasped the mallet. When he was fast asleep from exhaustion, she approached him stealthily and drove the pin through his temple till it went down into the ground. Thus he died. Now Barak appeared in pursuit of Sisera. Jael went to greet him and said, "Come, I will show you the man you are looking for." He went inside with her, and there was Sisera lying dead with the pin in his temple. On that day God subdued King Yavin of Canaan before the Israelites. The hand of the Israelites bore harder and harder on King Yavin of Canaan until they destroyed King Yavin of Canaan. Ouch.
Mm-hmm.
Quite the headache.
Yeah. So this. Yeah. So there's a lot going on here, like an absolutely lot. First, let's talk about Deborah. So Deborah is the only female judge, and is the only one that's also not like a military leader. That she's more like, say, like when, the beginning of chapter 4, we didn't read that, like she's actually more of like a legal arbitrator kind of deal.
She really is a judge, as opposed to like Samson. And I'll keep going back to Samson because I think he's a great example.
Don't worry, we're gonna get to Samson later in this study.
I think he's a great example of, we call him a judge, but he was not a great person. Like he was, I don't know what he judged other than like, causing trouble, lying, and all this sort of stuff. And I think you get that with a lot of the other judges too, where as I said before, it's like, are they a prophet bringing a message of God, or are they actually doing something that a judge does? Because a large part of Moses and Joshua's job, right, is that legal, is like solving disputes, because you've got an entire society wandering in the wilderness, and like, problems come up, like people argue over like whose tent is whose and where's the property line and all this, and Moses is the arbitrator of that, and that's the judge's job when they get into the land of Israel, and that's what Deborah is doing. all the other judges are just, out there killing people, being militaristic, doing I don't know what. Deboarh actually is like doing the job of a judge.
The super feminist, cynical part of me wants to go, it's because they're men. So is there a better translation than judge for the name of this book, or what these individuals
it's
are called?
Judge.
It is
literally,
judge.
it's Shoftim is the name of the book in Hebrew.
Okay.
And it literally means judges.
Okay. That's what I found too, but didn't know if you had a little bit more of a nuanced view on that, or better understanding of Hebrew. Certainly you have a better understanding of Hebrew than I do. That's common knowledge. But
well, I think it's their when this was assembled, they're trying to find a term that is somewhere in between. It's not a leader like Moses and Joshua. It's not going to be a king like Saul and David and the ones that come after them. It's not going to be a prophet like Samuel or Nathan.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're not a prophet and you're not a king and you're not a leader,
what are you?
What are you?
Yeah.
And so I think
that was the best they could come up with.
That was what they came up with was judges. It's another type of leadership, of the role that they're filling in between the leaders.
Yeah. All right.
The other leaders.
So, Deborah, it says that she is a woman of Lapidoth. I'm sure I said that horribly. Which, some say that denotes her marital status as the wife of Lapidoth. Alternatively, Lapid translates as torch or lightning. Therefore, the phrase could also be referring to her as a fiery woman. This is about accurate. What's your take?
So the Hebrew is literally the wife of, is Eshet Lapidot.
Oh, I thought it was the woman.
It would be Isha if it was. So the line, verse 4, going back, verse 4 is Deboarh Isha Neviah. Deborah was a woman prophet. Isha here is woman.
Got it.
Neviah is prophet. Eshet Lapidot, because of the way it's conjugated, Eshet Lapidot, it would be like the wife of Lapidot, and then it says He shofta et Yisrael, she judged Israel.
Sweet. Well, I will tell the scholars over at Working Preacher that they need to consult their rabbi before they publish these things.
Yeah.
So I love that says that she's the only female judge. She is also a prophet, and I like in the Song of Deborah in 5:7 that she is the mother in Israel. I love that title that they give to her is awesome. So here we go. Here's the Lord commanded violence of it. The Lord. Deborah tells Barak, so her military general, that the Lord commands you to gather the tribes at Mount Tabor and draw out Sisera and his troops, and the Lord will give him unto your hands.
Yeah, it's, they're starting a war. They're starting a holy war. God is telling them go to war, and it's not the first time that God has told them to do that, right? It happens with the Philistines. It happens with Amalek. It happens with the Canaanites, the Yevusites, a lot of other, like I said, there's a bunch of those nations, and it works because they're going to be successful because God has commanded it, and it's not just going off to pick a fight, but they know at least that they have God on their side when they're going.
Yeah. Let's talk about the discrepancies between chapter 4 and chapter 5.
Sure.
Because, chapter 4, as we just read, is sort of the story of what happens here. And chapter 5 is this Song of Deborah, which basically recounts the story and talks about the glory that was theirs. But they don't technically, they don't really, say the same thing.
Yeah, they don't exactly line up. It's interesting if you look at it. It's almost like prose versus poem, or poetic.
Yes.
Prose versus.
Yeah, it is. It's prose.
Verse. I don't know.
Yeah.
But chapter 5 gives us a slightly different view as to what's happening.
Yeah. And chapter 5 is older than chapter 4.
Yes, I would say that it is, that the Hebrew is an older form of Hebrew if you're looking at the grammar and the structure of the words.
Yeah.
And we know that, just like the Song of the Sea, and I'll keep on comparing these two, but the Song of the Sea is older Hebrew than most of the other parts of the Exodus that are around it. And if you look at the Song of the Sea, chapter 15 tells a different story than chapter 14 when you're talking about the splitting of the sea.
Yeah.
Just like here, if you read it really closely and you need some of the Hebrew for the nuance, chapter 5 tells a little bit of a different story with Jael and Sisera than what chapter 4 told us.
Well, so that's something that we do talk about on this podcast, to understand that there are multiple authors in different places of the Bible, and that a lot of these stories are kind of compiled, right? So that they may not be written at the same time, and so they can, better than we can in English, obviously. In the Hebrew, you can see those differences. And it also just is a fact of understanding that, like, the Bible is not one cohesive book. As, some more literalist Christians, this is,
and those to the right in Judaism.
Yeah, like the exactly. Yeah. Okay, well, how do you then different, like how do you, what's the word? How do you resolve that, like that things don't line up?
Yeah.
Or like even my favorite is to talk about the flood story, right? That they're like on top of each other. That there are two flood stories being told like almost at the same time. Like
there's two floods. How many animals did Noah take with him into the ark? Right.
One paragraph, two. Next paragraph, 7 of it. Like it's just.
Right. There. One of my other favorites is if you look at Genesis 1 and 2.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, we
two
talked about
completely different creation stories, right? In one, humanity is created last moment right before the Sabbath, right? 6th day, last thing that's created is humanity. And then you get to chapter 2, and humanity is created first.
Yeah.
And then everything's created around them, right? 2 and 1, male and female, are created together in a single moment,
simultaneously.
And then in chapter 2, all of a sudden you've got this whole story of Adam going to sleep and the rib being taken and woman being created from that, which is not male and female being created together. They're two different stories.
So anyways, but that's the drawing here to understanding, is sort of like a textual understanding that like chapters 4 and 5 do talk about the same story, but they tell the story slightly differently.
Right.
And so, as you had noted before we started recording, right? So, like, in chapter 4, he's in the tent, he's laying down, like, sleeping, when she, pounds a tent peg through his head. And in chapter 5, he's standing.
He's standing, right. So if you look at chapter 5, verse 27, the Hebrew word that is used once he gets his temple pierced with something, right? It says, well, first let's look at that, right? In chapter 26, in verse 26, rather, right? In the English, we can even read it. Her right hand for the workman's hammer, right? She took the 10 pin and the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera and crushed his head, smashed and pierced his temple.
Yeah.
Right? So now, even that is to start with a different way of death. Like, yes, he gets the tent peg again piercing his temple, but all of a sudden his head is also smashed. I mean, she's got a hammer in her hand, so it's not, a few extra blows with the hammer, and we're talking about a crushed head here.
I mean, they also had, like, real big tent stakes, right? Like,
right. We're not talking about, like, the
little REI oil.
And then in verse 27, it says the Hebrew, right? Ben ragleha kara nafal. Right? Between her legs, he fell.
Yeah.
And that is the nuance that you don't get if you're reading just the English, which is, in chapter 4, as we said, he was laying down, covered in a blanket. He was sleeping. When this happened, here you can only fall, and we don't mean like he fell in battle as in died in battle. We mean here it's he really like he's falling down between her legs, and is there, laying outstretched between her legs. You can only fall if you're standing. And so all of a sudden, he wasn't laying down sleeping, but she just took the thing, maybe, I don't know, from the back when he had his back turned, and went, the tent peg into his head.
It seems like a lot harder than if you were just laying on the ground.
It does, but if you hit him with the mallet first and then
That's fair, yeah,
a double,
yeah.
both ways. But
I mean, if she did smash his head, like clearly she hit him multiple times, and that.
Right, and so there's that, and there's also, I'm working backwards here, but in verse 25, right, he asked for water, she offered milk, and then he ate cheese curds instead, right? So like again, we're adding details, and so it's it's sort of same story but slightly different.
I love cheese curds. Absolutely love cheese curds. Big deal in the upper Midwest.
I was gonna say, where are you from?
Yeah. But here's the whole thing. If I was just like running, I don't know, a couple miles or so, and I'm like, dude, can I have some water? And then someone gives me cheese curds instead, I don't know if I'd be into that in that moment.
No, you want something like to cool you down, or especially you're in Israel,
yeah.
So like
it's pretty hot.
It's right. You're not. It's not. It's not. It's a hot climate.
But I think it's meant to be more of a. In my understanding, it's more of a seduction move, right? Like she's offering him not just water, but more fancy things, more luxurious things, more something fitting of an ally, a general, in someone that like your clan is allied with, right?
Yes, I would also say it's a strategic move. I don't know if you still do it, but I know when I was a little kid, if I had trouble falling asleep, what did your parents give you? Benadryl, right? No. No, a glass of warm milk, right? A glass of warm milk helps you fall asleep, right? It causes drowsiness. I don't know the science behind it. I'm sure one of your listeners will correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure many of them also like a glass of warm milk before bed. And so here we have this whole thing about, him hiding, going to sleep, and what's she offering him? Milk before he goes to sleep. It doesn't seem like it's nighttime when this whole thing is happening.
Yeah.
Right? It's a battle in the middle of the day. He's hiding out, and then he just takes a nap. So, if you're
probably a little exhausted, I could see that. But
I would think the adrenaline's going off. Like, he just escaped. He's one of a few survivors.
Yeah.
And here it's like, okay, I'm going to take a nap. Like, everyone's trying to kill me. I'm going to go take a nap. I wouldn't do it if it was me.
Yeah, maybe he was standing then. I don't know.
Right, but the milk, I would say perhaps it's warm milk that, helps him fall asleep and causes the exhaustion, which makes her move, Elle's move, a little more premeditated than just,
I think it's totally premeditated. So here's, so let's talk about Jael a little bit. So she is a Kenite, so she's not an Israelite, so her clan is different, and the text does tell us they're on good terms with the Canaanites, right? Like, she has, that's in theory why he would have gone to them, right? Like, these are our allies, these are safe people to take refuge with.
Yeah.
And so she kind of takes advantage of that situation. So the question is, like, why? Why does she intervene here? Like, it doesn't benefit her clan to, kill one of her allies, because her clan's at peace with them, right? Does she just kind of see the writing at the wall that the Israelites look like they're winning? Might as well back the winners, make some new friends, just kind of a moment of gain?
Yeah, this goes back to, like,
why,
what you were
why
saying.
does she do it, right?
Well, I think this goes back to what you were saying about the God-ordained element of this, right? Is that if we look at different parts of the Bible, right? Because reading this in isolation, I think it stays a question, right? The text doesn't give us enough information to explain why she does it if you're reading just chapter 4 or chapter 5. But if you look at other places in the Bible where you have people betraying their own kind or their own tribes, their own society, you find that there's a couple places, and it tends to be women, where they see that God that God ordained that the Israelites were going to win the battle, and they make moves to help advance that narrative for their own safety, for their own
do you think maybe
protection.
Faith, like, right? Like, is there a potential that she was developing faith in the God of the Israelites?
Yeah, so yes, because it's also those for those societies, for those tribes.
I mean, they're kind of cousins. Like, would they already kind of like have that?
They're cousins, but they can also have more than one God. So them having faith in the God of Israel doesn't betray their own, right? This isn't that they were converting and becoming Israelites, right? I don't think it's on that path, but I think it's saying, like, we recognize that the God of Israel, who we can also believe in, might actually be powerful here and is going to win, and so they go with that side rather than their own. But you see that at various points in the Bible. It happens with Joshua and I'm blanking.
Rahab?
Yes, thank you. Rahab.
See, you're nice.
Right. But when the walls of Jericho fall, right? Like, there's one person who's with her family in their apartment. She, helped the spies, and she's gonna, bring down the walls of Jericho, and she's gonna survive because of it.
Yeah. So
more ordained violence.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about sort of the morality of Jael's actions, right? And I'm not even talking about killing yet. We'll get to that in a moment. But this hospitality is an issue here. Like, hospitality is a huge, like, sacred thing in the ancient world. We've talked about that when it came to, the hospitality of Abraham, the hospitality of, sort of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, like the lack of hospitality being the big issue there. Like, this is huge. So what does it mean then, like, she invites him in and shows him that sort of hospitable grace and then kills him? Like, that's a huge sort of, like, moral violation of the understanding of hospitality.
And sanctuary.
Yeah.
Right? And sanctuary. But again, I think it's,
But we see no criticisms of that.
We see no criticism, right? That's what I was going to get there.
Because
it's the
winning side, right? Like, her actions benefit, the people of Israel. So, like, there's no question of whether or not what she
can be trusted by the victors, right? So I don't think that, again, because it's Judges, it's this episode, and then that's it, right? We're moving on.
But see, to me, like that, so my struggle with that is it holds in contrast a quality that, or sort of a sacred understanding of hospitality that God has previously laid out with God's people, to then ordain this sort of non-hospitable thing. It puts that to me in direct contrast of what God wants of us.
However, right? Please
do.
I'm going to challenge that because I think we're comparing. We both want to say the same thing, right? We both wanted to say, like, yes, there's these two moments of hospitality, and clearly what Jael does is a violation of it. It's made okay because it's the winning side, and it helps that narrative. But I think in a way we're also comparing apples to oranges here. Oranges.
We got it. We got it.
Because we're talking about two very different circumstances. Abraham is a time of peace where he's set up his tent specifically at the roadside in order to be this way stop for travelers. And here we're talking about war with Jael. And so I don't know if it's exactly the same. There's other values, right? Like we said, like sanctuary that she's maybe violating or something like that. But I don't know that this is the same sort of hospitality that Abraham was offering so much as, let me save you. So I think maybe there's a little bit of a nuanced difference of the situation.
But I think it also then kind of draws into this question, right? Like, when is it okay to act with violence? Right? Like, that is like the deep existential question. We don't have to answer that yet. I actually want you to answer something else first.
Okay.
So, like, let's talk about the killing thing, right? So the thing that, like, is really hard for Christians to wrestle with in this, which I think in a moment when I let you speak, you're going to explain it very well to them. So, when we hold up the Ten Commandments, right? Thou shalt not kill. Now, as we have talked about on the podcast before, that there are actually 6 different Hebrew words that talk about killing, and only actually one of them is prohibited. And God never does this one. But that, like, because God does kill and smite a lot of people, right? So, like, so how do y'all reconcile that or talk about that?
So let's get back into that nuance, right? It does not say, thou shalt not kill in the 10 Commandments. What does it say? Thou shalt not murder.
Right? I think I think it depends on your English translation, right? Because again, so there's the reason, right? Like a lot of, I would say a lot of people don't necessarily understand the difference.
That's a huge moral problem. Right. So the Hebrew, though, right? The Hebrew, when we're talking about the Hebrew, the better translation is do not murder, right? Killing would be to solve problems on a whim in war, right? Those other, even accidental killing, right? You're working on a construction project and the ladder falls over and the person, gets injured and dies from their injuries. Did you kill them, right? There's lots of horrible situations we can go where there's something like an accidental death, right? That someone else is responsible for. Those aren't necessarily murder, something done out of rage, out of passion, with intent to do it. Premeditated or in the moment, right? There's
so what's it then the difference
behind
between
murder, I think.
So I would think of like in war, in battle, that is premeditated killing of other people,
but not individuals, right? Like I think murder is you target specific people. I know there's like a lot of nuance that we can pick.
That's
up
what I'm
here,
saying. This is why this is where it gets
war is war. You're just going. You're battling it out, I guess, right? And you're not actually intent on killing any one individual person or set of persons. You're just going to fight, and it's like that kill or be killed thing. Any which way, I think that the Bible sees war very different than murder, which it sees as personal.
So, what you're saying, like, so for people that, like, very much, and again, I'm speaking more for Christians that take this tone of sort of like a super pacifist, non-violent tone, that's actually not what God is talking about.
In the 10 Commandments.
Yes.
Yes. In the 10 Commandments. In other places, look, you have the cities of refuge that are set up in the Torah as well, right? In the 5 books of Moses, which, in the case of an accidental death, lets someone flee to one of those 6 cities where they can live in refuge, right? Where they don't have to worry about a blood revenge, right? Because there is in the Bible this sense that if I accidentally kill someone, that their family has the right to avenge that person's death on me, unless I'm sitting in one of those cities of refuge. And if I'm in one of those cities, they aren't allowed to touch me. And as long, and at a certain point when the high priest dies, everything is right. Like then I can leave that city and they can't get their revenge on me, right? It's sort of like been long enough. Turn of administration. I don't know how exactly it was decided like that, but God decided that. And so, yeah, you're allowed, right? There are, I hate to use the word, but like honor killings, but like that is an idea in the Torah of, you killed someone, I'm allowed to kill you in return. It's not, and I know saying like you killed me, so I killed you. Well, you also
have like, right, like the Torah does like support the death penalty, right? Like, here are all the reasons we should kill you.
So, great question. I was going to go for eye for an eye first, right?
Oh, okay.
Which is, we all say, an eye for an eye. So, again, like when reading the Torah, that line, right, an eye for an eye, comes at the end of a list of monetary repayments for various injuries. And so most biblical scholars, Jewish biblical scholars, look at it and they don't mean that if I poke out your eye, you're allowed to just take a pencil and poke out my eye. It means that if I poke out your eye, I owe you the money for an eye, right? The cost of an eye for an eye, that it's a monetary thing, not a literal, we poke each other's eyes out. Going back to the other question,
the death penalty, right? Like here are all the like in the Levitical laws, it's sort of like, well, they do this, kill them.
Yes, for the most part though, a lot of those death penalty things are in there as a deterrence, and there's very little evidence that that it was ever carried out. So for instance, there's a death penalty offered for violating the Sabbath, right? And there is one story of someone who was like collecting firewood on the Sabbath and was stoned to death for it. But that's like one example amongst thousands of years. And by the time we get to the rabbinic tradition a few thousand years later, and we get to the Mishnah and the Talmud, which are like, 1st to 4th, 5th century CE, the way the rabbis structure it is there's like a very specific script that needs to be followed in order to enact the death penalty, which is like me coming up to you and saying, Pastor AJ, did you know that by collecting that firewood, you are violating the Sabbath? And you have to respond very specifically, yes, I know that by doing this, collecting firewood, I am violating the Sabbath. And then I have to say to you, did you know that if you continue to do that, you are liable for death, for being put to death? And you have to say, yes, I know that, and I don't care. And it has to be done in front of 2 other witnesses other than you or me. And so, like, any variation from that script, and we say, well, maybe it wasn't clear, and so we don't enact the death penalty. And so the rabbis do a great deal later on to sort of walk back the idea of the death penalty, and that it's more just there as a deterrent or to express how severe that violation of those commandments are. But it is in there. So, I think that all this goes to say is that the rabbis are really, the rabbis of later times are really uncomfortable with a lot of the stuff that the Torah says when it comes to some of that.
I think we're all uncomfortable, and that's, a good reason to, kind of dive into some of this. Could you let's talk about sort of a Jewish understanding of violence, because Christians do, I think, have a little bit different view because of, because of Jesus and that stuff. So let's talk about, not pacifism, and that violence can be condoned in, self-defense or in, protecting the innocent kind of thing, or being the lesser of the evils, right? To kind of combat evil.
Yeah. To start off with, in Judaism from the outset, right? God has a number of different names in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses. And God is very upfront and says one of them is El-Kana, which means a jealous God, right? So from the start, we know that we have a jealous God who isn't afraid to use violence to kill people, right? Let's start with, the flood story, like you said, right? From the start, God is wiping out the earth, and it takes Moses, right? It takes, Abraham negotiating with God to try to not wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah, and Moses negotiates with God to not wipe out the Israelites in the middle of the desert, right? And does it by saying, God, if you kill them all, the Egyptians are going to say, look at that God. God took them out of Egypt only to kill them in the desert. And, so Moses sort of uses that against God to negotiate saving people. But it's clear that God uses violence a lot, and also, as we've said, gives permission to the Israelites at various points to use violence.
But it's very specific.
It's very specific.
It's very specific. He's not saying kill whoever you want, whenever you want. No, it's in very specific circumstances.
It is, and when the Israelites go and try to do something, start a war or anything like that without God's permission, we tend to see disastrous results. One of the great examples is right in the book of Joshua, where they're going to attack the Philistines, right? And or maybe it's later than Joshua, but God says don't, right? And the people say, well, we're going to bring the Ark of the Covenant with us into battle, and then we're going to win. And they do, and God lets the Ark of the Covenant get captured by the Philistines because God said, don't do it, and the people went and did it anyways, and it wasn't God-sanctioned violence in that way, and so they end up losing, and the Ark gets captured, and then they have to, wait to get it back. God bestows another type of violence on the Philistines, which is hemorrhoids, and that's, might be worse than being put to death.
All of the violence. So what is sort of, I guess, to explain sort of the Jewish mindset on war?
I can't speak for all Jews, right? I think it's.
I mean, from like a theological perspective, right? I was talking about before we recorded. Sort of, this is the ELCA's social statement on peace and violence, and has a section about like war and like deterring and all that stuff. Is like, again, like we, kind of biblically derive, that.
So, I think war is seen, unfortunately, as necessary, right? It's not optimal. It is tragic. It is horrific. People die. Soldiers die. Innocents die. There's on both sides. There's no question about that. But we also recognize that sometimes war is necessary. That not everything can be solved by negotiation or by any other means. And war is a necessity, and an unfortunate necessity. With risk of stepping into it with many people, I think that what's happening right now in Israel is an example of that, right?
Yeah.
First, right, the Israeli army isn't called an army; it's called the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. For the majority of their of Israel's existence, right, Israel doesn't pick those fights. The army is there to defend its people, not to pick fights with others. That doesn't mean they don't go on the offensive, right? They're very much on the offensive now.
Yeah.
But if we look back to almost a year ago, they didn't start this, right?
Yeah.
The attack, the initial attack, came from Hamas and their forces, and Israel responded to it. We can talk about the morality of the response and, has Netanyahu gone a little bit overboard? Are the objectives achievable? Those are all, I think, part of the conversation, but there's also a recognition that, what Israel's trying to do is defend its people more than anything else, is make sure that people can live in peace and security and not have to worry that they're at a music festival and going to be slaughtered.
Mm-hmm. So this is, I really like this. This is the purity of arms code from the Israeli Defensive Forces. It says, "The soldier shall make use of his weaponry and power only for the fulfillment of the mission and solely to the extent required. He will maintain his humanity even in combat. The soldier shall not employ his weaponry and power in order to harm non-combatants or prisoners of war, and shall do all he can to avoid harming their lives, body, honor, and property."
Yeah, and they try to live up to that. Do they always live up to it? No, they don't, right? They're soldiers, they're humans, and sometimes they fail. But I think organizationally, that's the perspective of the IDF, more so than we're going to go and pick fights, because there's a lot of people that they could pick fights with in their region, and they really try not to. But they are willing to defend the Israelis who live in their nation, in their territory, and so again, Judaism doesn't love violence. Modern Judaism doesn't love violence, but it also recognizes that sometimes war is necessary. We pray for peace. We absolutely pray for peace, but we recognize that sometimes
Yeah.
it's going to happen.
So I'm gonna read another quote. So this is from the ELCA social statement on peace, which came out in 1995, and I will attach it. So the ELCA social statement on peace is that we strive for peace, and we at all times try to find a violent approach to resolving any issues, as well as it does dive into some politics around military and weapons, and that the ELCA advocates for doing away with weapons of mass destruction and, a lot of violence. But just the ELCA is against the militaristic part of it. Anyways, but I want to read this because I think that it will agree very much with what you're saying. This is what the ELCA stance is. Love of neighbor obligates us to act to prevent war and to seek alternatives to them. Yet wars and their other things thrust themselves upon us, and we cannot avoid making decisions about them. In doing so, we face conflicting moral claims and agonizing dilemmas. Helping the neighbor in need may require protecting innocent people from injustice and aggression. While we support the use of nonviolent measures, there may be no other way to offer protection in some circumstances than by restraining forcibly those harming the innocent. We do not, then, for the sake of the neighbor, rule out possible support to the use of military force. We must determine in particular circumstances whether or not military action is the lesser evil.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a good statement. The Jewish perspective, you have to add on to it that, like, for most of our lives, we've been persecuted, right?
Yeah.
And we have things in our history
Yeah.
that maybe make us a little bit quicker to defend ourselves in stronger ways. But yes, right, we would rather a negotiated settlement, right?
Oh, yeah.
Jews, right? And I'm not even talking about Israel here. Jews would rather nonviolent negotiated conflict resolution, but also, when we're worried about people coming into our synagogues with guns, I'm going to have people who can help defend us, whether it's an armed security officer or, our security team, and different ways that we can stop an intruder very quickly, because I'm not going to ask to negotiate in that moment with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And and I think you do bring up a good perspective to talk about, like, to me, like power, right? Like, for a population that's been persecuted so much over the course of history, obviously that that makes sense in a collective historical precedent and understanding of violence that's been coming at the Jewish community for, I don't know, ever. Right? And
Pretty much.
And and I think
but at the same time,
to me that's super fair, right? And
right.
Again, so there are perspectives, and I don't know if there are in Judaism, but there are Christian perspectives that are, like, very pacifist, like violence is never okay, even in self-defense.
No, we would not say turn the other cheek, right?
Yeah.
We are very much not that. At the same time, though, it's, again, like the statement, and like we've been saying with the IDF, is that it's in defense of who we are and all that. To throw Christianity under the bus here, right? Like, we don't have the Crusades where we go on, holy wars to free cities. We happened to free Jerusalem in 1967, but we didn't. Again, Israel was attacked, and we made gains, and we happened to gain control or Israel happened to gain control of Jerusalem in that war, but we've never gone on crusades in the name of religion.
Oh yeah, don't get me wrong. We can talk about the doctrine of discovery and how horrible that Christians are. That literally to the ends of the earth would go into places and try to convert them to Christianity, and if not, kill them and take the land.
Right.
That was what they believed that they were doing in the name of Christ.
Right.
Christ would have been incredibly appalled by that. And again, so that's the folks that take sort of a really staunch anti-violent approach of nonviolence is this idea that like Jesus didn't even lift a finger to save himself, that it was like in order to follow that's why that. But speaking of,
do they not approve of the Crusades, those pacifists then, or how do they
No.
deal with the Crusades?
No,
No.
I don't think there's a lot of modern Christians that approve of the Crusades. Some might, like there are. I just got done reading a book that talked about kind of some issues going on in current conservative evangelicalism, and like people are, making statements and promoting that like we need to go to battle for the soul of Christianity and the nation and blah 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 blah. And so like it's there, right? And so you get you get this put on the armor of Christ and stuff, and so like you get there's language that kind of supports that kind of stuff, and so like I can get it, but I want to, first of all, just as a note, this a lot of like Lutheran theology, right, that we very much center on what I call the to-do list rather than the not to-do list, right? Like we could spend years talking about what you should and should not do, but we call it the to-do list, right? God says, love God, love your neighbor. And so that's also the foundation of this this statement on peace, as well as many other things that we would say from a Lutheran perspective, like what we believe and why. And as a side note, a lot of Christians think that Jesus said that. I know. I thought it would. It actually comes from Leviticus, and so that's why Jesus was, quoting his own scriptures, right? Like when he talks about these things, but that's an important key component. And so I really say that for the audience to know that like we share that, right? Because I think, again, when people attribute that to Jesus, it's like, no, Jesus didn't come up with that, right? Like that is...
And it plays a huge part in Judaism too. There's a midrash, a rabbinic tale of this stranger who shows up at a great rabbi's house, right? One of our greatest rabbis that we have like in our tradition, and says, can you teach me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot? And the answer is v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your fellow, love your neighbor as yourself. The rest is just commentary, go and learn.
Yeah.
Right? And so like that, so like in our tradition, right, that's Hillel is the rabbi who said it. But that's like people come back to that over and
that's
over
a great
and over,
story.
and everyone
I
knows
love
it.
that. Yeah, I'm gonna use that. That's
right. And so like that's that it's not Jesus, it's in the Torah, and it plays a big part in Judaism too. For us though, we have we use other pieces of the Torah to say, okay, yes, we should absolutely love and care about our neighbors, and also we should defend ourselves.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means violence.
Yeah. So let's talk about God-ordained violence. And so I want to kind of bring this up as sort of like, this are ways that Christians kind of deal with or conceptualize or, mitigate a lot of violence that happens in the Hebrew Bible. Still violence in the New Testament, but we like to pin everything on the Hebrew Bible first. And so I want to hear your take, because I think you're not going to like a few of these, and I'm really excited to hear about that. First, to note that like, to understand that the Bible is very violent. It is a very violent book. There's a lot of killing, a lot of war, a lot of genocide. There's a lot of things that happen. And the number one, do you know who the number one killer in the Bible is?
Who the number one killer? God?
God.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of people like really uncomfortable to think about. Like the number like. By a landslide, too.
I don't know, but it's God.
So let's get into these approaches, right? Like, how do we, how do we work with this? First of all, I do want to read just a fun quote by Richard Dawkins. Do you know who that is?
No.
He's an atheist, a very outspoken atheist, and he's a British evolutionary biologist and zoologist. This is what he says of God. He says that God is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, a vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniac, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
Yes, I would agree. And God is also loving and caring and compassionate and all those things,
Yeah.
right? You can't reduce God to one set of, we're humans. We can reduce ourselves to one thing or one type of characteristic as our defining trait. I don't think you can with God, because yes to what he said, and then also find the antonyms for every one of those descriptions, and God is also that, because God is everything.
Okay, so you ready? So here is possible Christian approaches to this violence. Number one, we Christians can reject the depiction of God here as an inconsistent God, because these violent depictions of God are we can reject the depictions of God here as inconsistent with the God that is revealed to us in Jesus. And this sort of approach considers any violent descriptions of God as human projections onto God.
No. I as Jews, we don't do that, right? Like we don't say, okay, I'm gonna like this picture of God and not that picture of God.
Well, I mean, like
because
Christians really like
that's-
to use Jesus as an excuse for everything.
Right.
So yeah.
Yes, but to reject any piece of God is to reject God as a whole, right? Like again, if and maybe this is because we don't have the devil in Judaism, right? The devil is a great tool in Christianity, I think, because it places the locus for evil outside of God, right? In Judaism, it's not, right? God is. We can say we don't understand why bad things happen to good people. We don't understand why horrific things happen, but it comes from God. And yes, we have to wrestle with that, but it adds to our relationship with God as opposed to being angry at God for those things. Although in Judaism, you're allowed to be angry at God. And again, that's okay, and
I always
it's
encourage
part of
Christians to be angry at God and to direct them to some fun psalms if you
Yeah,
really just need to be really angry
there are
at God.
some really good psalms if you want to be angry at God. One of the things that I love teaching is that our name Yisrael, right, the people of Israel, right, where does that come from? It comes from when Jacob was wrestling with God, like physically wrestling with the angel that was God, right, that was representing God. And that name Yisrael literally means to wrestle with God.
Yeah.
And that is the theological perspective that Judaism has embraced from its very beginnings of you should question. If you read something in the Torah that you don't like, you should question it and you should challenge it and you should discuss it. And that doesn't break faith. That doesn't put you at odds with God or with the tradition. It's encouraged to dig deeply into it. And so when we read something that's troubling about God, that God wiped out all the people in the world except for Noah, right? You can question it, sure, but like it's going to be part of that relationship and our understanding of God, not as something that we can say, oh no, it didn't really happen. It was something else, or God changed to not be like that.
Yeah.
No, God doesn't change, right? God is eternal, right? God is, was, and always will be. That's the constant.
Yeah. First of all, I agree with everything that you've said, and I believe that in my own theology as well. I also really struggle with this personified devil that is in Christianity because of just that. Like, I think it takes power away from God. Yeah, which I don't even know how we profess that, right? In one line we say that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, creator of heaven and earth, over everything, and then...
But evil's over here.
But yeah. I'm with you on that one. Okay, ready? Here's option number 2. We can reinterpret the descriptions of violence to make them less confronting. As in, right, viewing them as hyperboles. That like kill every living thing is a hyperbole. It doesn't actually mean literally to, kill every living thing. And that violence is not the goal but rather it is the human byproduct of God's objectives.
So I want to go back to something that you said, right? That we can sort of like overlook, because it's something. I hear it in both, right? I hear it, and I bet any other descriptions they have it, I'm going to hear it as well, right? Is this desire for God to not be violent or have those bad traits, because Jesus came and made everything rosy and wonderful, and didn't say love your neighbor, but had that mentality. I'm going to show my misunderstanding of the Trinity here, but let's go with it, right?
You're good. Go for it.
Why can't the Father and the Son be different, right? Why do they have to be the same, right? We are not all the same as our parents. Our parents have qualities that we don't have. We have characteristics, attitudes, approaches that are different. And so for Christianity, I would say, rather than running and trying to say that Jesus's arrival and death and resurrection changed God, which I think is a super problematic theological statement. And again, I'm the Jewish person saying that, right? But like the fact that like any being could alter God, I think is problematic.
Well,
why not hold both of them and say like, we have these two different examples.
Yeah.
We prefer this one, right? Which is what the original statement on violence said. We prefer the peaceful solution, but we have the violent solution in our back pocket if we need it. And we know that actually, if we have to resort to violence in defense of the innocent, that God is okay with that, and we're not committing a sin or a transgression.
Yeah. So the quick Christian lesson then is Christians do not differentiate between God and Jesus. That Jesus is God coming to earth. In that Jesus is like a piece of God, that he is fully God and fully human. And that he is not actually differentiated. So the Nicene Creed is the one that's like, it says like in the line, it's that he is eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made. And that language in the Latin is actually homoousios, which just literally means like the same substance. Like if you imagine God as flubber, this is my easiest way to describe it to like confirmation students. If God is like a big ball of like slime, dough, flubber, whatever you want, and you take a chunk off and like roll it into a separate ball or Play-Doh, right? Like it's still the same thing. It just like was separated, but then when Jesus dies and resurrected, that chunk of flubber is then joined back with the rest of it.
Okay. So then what I said, like I said, is a misunderstanding, but...
Yeah, it's fine. But you know what? That was probably a good confirmation lesson for our listeners to go through with it too. Okay, here's the next one. This is why I was really excited as I was going through all of these. I was like, oh, he is going to have a heyday with these. Option 3 of how Christians typically take on this God-ordained violence. We can assert... No, you're going to like...
I was thinking it's all the Jews' fault, and then we can talk about anti-Semitism, so you know.
Well, that's a whole separate rant. Like when you go into like, we've talked about this, like the idea of like supersessionism and all that kind of... Anyways, this one you might not actually dislike a lot. We can assert God's right to judge the world this way. That it is God's right to give life and take it away.
Yeah, 100%. You know, we actually we say that at funerals. One of the lines that we say when we begin a funeral, one of the first things that we do is called kriya, is like the tearing of a ribbon or a piece of clothing to show who's in mourning, which it tends to be the closest family are the direct mourners. One of the lines that we say in that ritual is Adonai natam v'Adonai lakach yehi shem Adonai mevarach. God has given, God has taken, praise be the name of God, right? Which is, we don't have a choice, right? We don't have a choice when we come into this world. We don't have a choice when we leave this world.
Yeah.
All of that is in God's hands. And, we still praise God even though that happens.
So we just have to live with it.
We just have to live with it. But
God's violent,
but
and we just have to live with that.
yeah, we have to live with it. But I think it adds to the relationship with God that we have, because it's not just random willy-nilly, right?
Mm-hmm.
I will say that. Sometimes it feels like that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's not. Like, if we look at who's being killed in the Bible, right? Sodom and Gomorrah, right? A wicked city. The Korach rebellion, right?
Enemies of Israel,
right?
yeah.
Who
Yes,
go
yeah.
who go against Moses, right? Who challenge Moses' leadership.
Mm-hmm.
The enemies of Israel, right? Amalek, this nation that we say attacked Israel from the back of the caravan as it wandered through the wilderness,
Mm-hmm.
where the elderly and the sick and the
Yeah.
children were, right? In the back
Yeah.
of this really long, caravan, they're attacking the rear. So it's not that God is just saying, go kill for fun, right? Again, we have that commandment, don't murder, right? Understand when there's an accidental death, understand that it wasn't intentional, and that person gets a chance at continuing to live. There is all that in Judaism, in the Bible. There's also a God that says, like, you mess with me and you mess with my people, and I'm going to show you why you shouldn't.
Yeah.
A
Yeah.
lot, and I think perhaps where a lot of it comes from, we didn't touch on this, right? But a lot of it may come from this initial idea that in establishing the religion, right, and here religion being Judaism, it is created in a society where there are lots of other religions going on.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, maybe it's heretical to say, but like Judaism borrows a lot of those different traditions
Yeah.
from surrounding cultures and makes it their own. We know this because if you look at the name of Canaanite gods, many of them are taken and used as the same name for God, the God of the Israelites, right? Or those names of the Canaanite gods appear in the Torah as people or gods we're fighting against. And a lot of what we can read is actually the God of the Israelites conquering other gods,
Mm-hmm.
right? We can reread that entire creation story, right? We mentioned Genesis 1.
Mm-hmm.
We can label that as God creating everyone else's gods, right? God created light on the first day with no sun and moon. So if you believe in a God of the sun who creates the light for the world, well, my God created light without the sun, and only 4 days later did my God create the sun and the moon, right? Which you pray to. My God actually created them. We have God conquering the Leviathan, right? Sea creatures, sea monsters that maybe other people are praying to. Throughout the Bible, we have God conquering other gods, right? God conquers Pharaoh to get the Israelites out of Egypt. Pharaoh was a god to the Egyptians. God conquers Pharaoh, right? So these people know that the God of the Israelites is the one true great God. God doesn't go and just kill the innocent person, sitting by doing nothing, right? God is using that violence to show who's in charge, I guess. Or when people step out of line, what happens when you challenge God or God's
Mm-hmm. chosen
chosen ones, Moses or the judges, the prophets later on. I think that's all part of it, right? So there is divinely ordained violence that is seen as okay, but that doesn't mean God is okay with violence as a whole.
Mm-hmm. All right, ready? Last option.
I didn't know I had another one. Great.
We can recontextualize the violence within these stories, seeing the violence in the context of God's bigger plan. For example, in Judges, right, like it's supposed to be horrific. It's supposed to be this kind of dark sequel to Joshua. Like it's supposed to be horrific so that when the kings come on, it shows this is the way things are supposed to be.
I'm not a fan of recontextualizing thing. Like, we're talking about an ancient society where war was war. Like,
Well, that God is
like,
not non-violent, but rather anti-violent. It's not right. I can see your eyes right. It's in God's nature to redeem, not destroy, not be bloodthirsty, but will defend, God's people. And
how do you explain the flood story? Like that,
I'm just telling you. I didn't say these are my ideas.
I think the flood story is a great example to sort of push back against every single one of these, because God says, like, I don't like the world. God says I messed up. Like, the world isn't good.
No, let's just start over.
We're just starting over. Like, there's no saving these people.
Yeah.
And I don't think it has anything to do with because Jesus wasn't here. We didn't have the 10 Commandments or anything like that. I think even God can recognize, like, I messed up. Like, so let's start again.
Yeah, part of this too also goes into like the idea that like God is not nonviolent but rather anti-violent, but that when God does act with violence, it's because it's punishment. Someone deserves it, right? And I struggle with this mentality for two reasons. The first is that leads to like what some Christians would call like the prosperity gospel, where like if you do good things, God rewards you. You do bad things, you get punished, right? So like this is the kind of theology that Trump subscribes to, right? That he is successful, right? That like, or people in that sphere, they're successful because God is rewarding them. Okay, well, if you take it in that, like, what did the kids in the school in Uvalde do?
Right.
Right, to deserve this divine, quote, punishment, right?
Correct. And it's something that we actually talk. So we have the high holidays coming up in a couple weeks. And we talk about it a lot because Yom Kippur, the holiest day of our year, right? We say like that's when our fates for the next year are written, right? At the new year, Rosh Hashanah, God is sitting there with the book of life in front of God and makes the inscription of like what type of year are we going to have next year, while looking back at who we were last year. Mm-hmm. And on Yom Kippur, that fate is sealed. We've got the 10 days from the first day of Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur to pray, repent, and try to change God's mind if a poor inscription was written. Obviously, we don't know what the inscription that was written was until we're standing there next year, right? But I think one of the things that really challenges people is like, so does that mean that like if I wasn't really good enough, like that God is not going to let me live for another year? And I don't ascribe to that either, right?
Yeah.
It's not about being good or bad and good things happen, right? I think God loves each and every one of us, and God loves humanity. I really also don't know that God cares whether or not I score a touchdown on Sunday in football, right? Or hits a home run as a baseball player. Our athletes love ascribing that to God wanted me to score a touchdown. I don't.
I know this is.
I don't know that God really has a favorite NFL team.
I'll say this. So like these were just these are options laid out. Someone and I just am presenting them. And so here my challenge then for the listeners, right? Like take time on this, discern like what this is your 5-week challenge, right? With all these things that we're going to talk about. What is your theology around violence, around violence that humans do, around violence that God does? How does this fit into the grand story? What does this tell us about God? That's the big question that I want people to wrestle with over the next 5 weeks, and that we're going to keep talking about.
Yeah, I think you should, and I would challenge them as the outsider, as someone who does wrestle with it, but because theologically we have a very different perspective. Mm-hmm. I would say that if they want to have a challenge from the rabbi, is to almost not use any of those options that you read, but rather try to not subdue it, right? To accept it and not try to explain it away or ignore it or make it into something rosy and that God is perfect and peace-loving and non-violent and all that, but try to accept that like God can be violent, and the God of the Bible is a jealous God, and uses violence for certain reasons, and that's not a bad thing. That doesn't make God bad, and it doesn't make what God is doing bad. It makes it a challenge to figure out how does that play into my understanding of God, my theology, and my relationship with God, knowing that God could kill people if God so chose.
Yeah. More good things to come. Thank you so much, Rabbi, for coming and opening.
My pleasure.
You just helped me open this big can of worms that we're going to continue to dive in. So I appreciate your expertise and coming to join us on this. Again, you can find those materials on our website. And remember that we have 4 more episodes about violence. So, tuck in, folks. Here we go. And remember, you can learn more about the 10-Foot Pole Podcast on our website and find us on Facebook and Instagram at 10-Foot Pole Podcast and wherever you listen to podcasts. And as always, the 10-Foot Pole Podcast is a ministry of the Delaware Maryland Synod. To learn more, go to demdsynod.org. Okay, take care, everyone.